Okay, let's talk about another set of theories regarding personality. That these are trait perspectives. So what is a trait? It's an enduring disposition that leads to characteristic responses. Well, at least we can presume that they do, because they sometimes don't, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the traits are, characteristics that we have. Perhaps how extroverted we are, how outgoing, how anxious we are, how conscientious and responsible we are. These are some examples of traits that we have, and that perhaps we all share in some level. And the idea is that these traits lead to characteristics. So, for example, if you're high on a trait called extroversion or being outgoing, then it likely means that you are going to frequently go to parties and be with other people and talk and be friendly to other people and stuff like that. And perhaps do a lot of, activities that are a lot of social activities. Well, perhaps it means you might do this more often than some other people, but it doesn't necessarily mean you do it all the time. But be that as it may, you are an extroverted is probably going to be more likely than an introvert to do all of those things that I just mentioned. The trait perspectives look at how our personality is built, and they look at traits, these characteristics that we have: extroversion, anxiety, conscientiousness, assertiveness, honesty, openness. All these are different kinds of traits. And the idea is that these traits are what our personality is built of. And so what the trait theorists want to do is try to understand the origins of these traits and how our personality is structured. They're also looking at perhaps how these traits might be related to the behaviors that we engage in. So there are a number of different trait theories that have different ideas about how personality is structured. Basically, the idea behind them, though, is that they're described by their typical behaviors. So the traits that are essentially are telling us what we do typically. There are strong versus weak tendencies. Maybe we have some strong traits that are very predictive of our behavior and that are really central to how we see ourselves. Well, there are some others that may be somewhat not as important, maybe weaker. So Gordon Alipore was one of the major trait theorists, one of the originators of it. And he basically argued that personality is understood through our traits. He would look at like the dictionary and look at how many ways in which words in the dictionary that describe people. Humble, humorous, silly, anxious, angry. All these are different traits that essentially kind of put into the jigsaw puzzle about who we are. According to the trait theorists, essentially our behavior is consistent across situations. That if we're extroverted, then we're going to be extroverted in a number of different situations. As we'll talk about later, that is certainly not always true. And he took a lexical approach. He started with words. He looked in the dictionary, found 4,500 different traits described in the dictionary. And from here, you want to be able to organize this in some way. Maybe those traits are, some of these traits are maybe, it's like different words for the same thing. So we kind of want to narrow it down. Another theory which essentially continues on today is the 5-factor model, the argument that our personality can be narrowed down into 5 basic traits. So you start with all of these, maybe like 4,500 traits, let's say, and then you can narrow them down. There's a statistical procedure called the factor analysis, which would allow you to kind of take these large bits of information, combine them where the information that fits together stays in one place, and information fits together in another way, fits in another place. So basically you can narrow down 4,500, let's say, into 5 broad basic traits which contain a lot of mini traits. And these would be the main dimensions of our personality. So the 5-factor model, which again, there's a lot of work done on these 5 factors. Basically, these 5 factors are basically like a set of various traits and behaviors that would fit into this particular category. So the trait of openness is actually a category of traits, such as being imaginative. On the other end of it is being practical. So you think about, like, on the one end being imaginative, on the other end being practical. On the one end liking variety, on the other hand preferring routine. So you see these are opposites. These particular traits that we're going to be talking about, they're like bipolar. In other words, you have high on one side, low on the other side. But all in all, where you fall on this continuum. For example, you might be very practical person who very much likes routine. So more on this end here, you'd probably be low in openness. Are you independent or are you conforming? So again, those are examples. Conscientiousness is another one of the big 5 traits. They call these the big 5. So the 5-factor model. Conscientiousness. Someone who is very, very organized, highly organized, would be high on the conscientiousness dimension. Someone who is disorganized, messy, they would be on the low end. Someone who's careful would be on the high end. Someone who's careless would be on the low end. Being disciplined would be on the high end, and being impulsive, acting without thinking, would be on the low end for conscientious. Extroversion, these are the party animals here. People who are highly sociable would be high on the extroversion dimension. Someone who would be retiring would be on the low end. Someone who's fun-loving would be on the high end. Someone who is somber would be on the low end. Affectionate on the high end. Reserved on the low end. These are the extroverts. Agreeableness. You think about being helpful, being kind. If you're soft-hearted, you're high on agreeableness. If you are ruthless, you are low on agreeableness. Sometimes you have very effective leaders who are pretty low on the agreeableness. They may be seeking power, and they're not really concerned about who they step on along the way. Well, these would be people who would be low in agreeableness. They may be high in extroversion. They may be high in conscientiousness, but a bit low on the agreeableness dimension. More agreeable means more trusting. More agreeable means more helpful. And finally, the last one, neuroticism, or stability, is the final dimension. Someone who is calm would actually be low on neuroticism. Someone who is anxious would be high on neuroticism. Someone who feels secure would be low on neuroticism. Insecure would be high on neuroticism. Someone who is self-satisfied would be low on neuroticism. Someone who is self-pitying would be high on neuroticism. Now realize, according to this model, these are 5 basic broad stroke traits that we have as humans. And basically, research has shown, like across different cultures, we have these 5 basic dimensions here. One of the things to keep in mind, the argument is that these are basically independent from each other. So in other words, you can have a score for each of these that's relevant to you. One person might be very high on openness, very low on conscientiousness, middle of the road on extroversion, middle of the road on agreeableness, and really high on neuroticism. And that could be one person's personality profile based on their scores on each of these 5 dimensions. And that's where human differences come into play. This is where individual differences are and the various combinations of how these 5 traits fit within us. And the Big 5 does seem to have some evidence in cultures around the world, and that's an interesting aspect of this particular theory. There's a researcher who says that it even shows up in animals, and that animals can have these 5 basic traits as well, if you observe animal behavior. Now realize the 5-factor model is not the only model of personality based on traits. You have I-Sync, who's also talked about traits. Well, he's also kind of links in with the biological perspective too. There's Cattell, who had basically 16 basic traits instead of just the 5. So it means there are variations of this. There are differences in terms of how the Big 5 traits are named. Notice the acronym we had there was OCEAN. Openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism spells out ocean. So if you want to remember it. Contributions. They're really finding that certain kinds of traits are very important for health. For example, conscientiousness is very predictive of our health of our physical health. Conscientious people, I guess, take care of themselves. They eat the right things. They behave responsibly. So they perhaps are less likely to suffer from various health problems. These traits influence how we think. Someone who is high in neuroticism, they think quite differently from someone who is very low in neuroticism. They observe the same situation but react quite differently. Conscientious people are usually going to be pretty successful. Extroverted people are going to be better salespeople, for example, probably. So in other words, there are various kinds of careers and hopefulness and success for various how you fall on these traits. Unfortunately, the theory really doesn't discuss much the situation, because the situation can really draw out certain kinds of behaviors in you above and beyond what you say about your own personality. So that's something to really consider, is that it's not just about you, it's also about the situation you're in. Also, when we're talking about these broad strokes here about these basic 5 traits, well, there might be some individual uniqueness that's missing in terms of the analysis of personality here. We're certainly not understanding why we have these traits. We just know that they are there. We also don't necessarily know the processes that are going on underneath, but that's where biology can perhaps come into play.